Welcome to the Wisdom of Show. I'm your host, Simon Bowen, and every week I'm speaking to the world's greatest leaders, thinkers, and entrepreneurs about complex issues and impactful leadership. Join us in the Renaissance of Wisdom. Well, welcome to this episode of the Wisdom of Show, and it's the wisdom of Rob Weir from Maguey Exchange, who has a fascinating story. You know, if we use the phrase from military to Mezcal, that probably doesn't hit everybody's horizon, but that's the story with an MBA in the middle and a whole bunch of business and large company experience. So, you know, from military to MBA to Mezcal and everything in between. We live in an increasingly complex world, socially, politically, economically, in communities, in technology. And, you know, people could be reeling right now today with the rate of change and where is the world headed. And then others are actually getting on with things and doing amazing things and taking whole industries forward. And Rob has a unique experience in active fields of combat where decisions really matter at life and death level. And, you know, and it's a tough operating environment. A graduate of West Point, and so a field officer, then came back, studied, got his MBA, worked as a management consultant at a very high level, but always had this passion for artisanal spirits and started in Mexico. We'll get to the story in a minute, but has really taken on an endeavor to transform an industry. So there are sound bites and whole conversations of wisdom laced all the way through Rob's story. And so I'm really looking forward to the episode, Rob. People will be able to read your full bio. But, you know, let's start.
Amazing.
Not with your, you know, military officer experience about leadership and everything else, which is often the conversation I end up having. Let's start talking about artisanal spirits, because I'm not sure when people think about let's disrupt an industry or change an industry, I know we'll go to artisanal spirits. I don't think that's everybody's first thought bubble. And I really just need to get the whole story first, and then we'll peel out from that and unpack things.
Yeah, absolutely. So, first of all, as introduction, Rob Weir, CEO of Maguey Exchange, and we're building the universal architecture and infrastructure for artisanal trade, starting with the $380 billion artisanal spirits and wine industry. And our platform reduces sourcing time and operational costs by connecting buyers directly with producers. And we define buyers as brands, importers, anyone that wants to source and procure artisanal spirits and wine from anywhere in the world, right? And the good stuff like mezcal, like wine, etc., is it's built on a farm, right? It's produced on a farm by someone that's probably rural, and they have been doing this for generations, right?
Yeah.
And the origin story of Maguey Exchange begins in 2009, right? I'm in a remote village in Oaxaca, Mexico, right? I'm backpacking through Latin America between my junior and senior year of college, right? And I meet a mezcal producer. And for those who don't know, mezcal is a cousin, has a relationship to tequila, everybody, like most of the world's favorite drink, because it's produced from the same plant, which is called an agave plant. And this producer specialized in a certain method of working with the agave plant that leads to it being called mezcal. Long story short, tequila is produced in Jalisco, which is a state of Mexico. Mezcal is produced in everything else, in every other state, right? His name is Rodrigo. And I bonded with Rodrigo for a couple of reasons. One, he gave me my first sip of mezcal, of his product that he distilled. And I had never tasted anything like that before, right? Being in college, I've been exposed to Jose Cuervo and the things that you can find in anything from a grocery store to a gas station. I had never tasted anything like that because it was so flavorful. And also the tradition. I was in his distillery, in his farm, on his land, trying his product, right? The second aspect that we bonded over is with that first sip, he introduced me to the wide world of artisanal spirits and wine production, where all of these things, mezcal, tequila, wine, etc., are produced by a family with heritage and generations of experience of production, right? And I had never really thought about where these things come from. And the third reason that we bonded was he shared the struggle. He shared that he struggled to support his family simply because he was in a remote region of Oaxaca, right? So buyers, people that would purchase his products, they had a hard time finding him. And he had a hard time finding the buyers as well. And when they did when they did happen to meet, there would be barriers in terms of communication and culture, right? To understanding, meeting that supply, that demand, so to speak, in capitalism, but really, him being able to supply those needs. And I thought it was strange that despite crafting exceptional spirits, he struggled to support his family because he couldn't reach, because of this barrier, right? He couldn't reach the right buyers, right? And that was my first exposure to artisanal spirits and wine. In the
Mm.
context, it's produced by families, it's produced by communities, often very far outside or a long distance outside of any city or any urban area. But they've been doing this for hundreds, sometimes thousands of years in different places of the world, right? Not just Mexico, not just Latin America, but also Asia, also Europe, right? And that's the foundation and bedrock of who we deal with um, in the business of my company, Maguey Exchange, as well as like the face behind a lot of the beverages that you enjoy with friends, family at
Yeah.
special events.
And even the name Maguey Exchange, right, has depth of meaning in terms of you're clearly on a mission. Like so many
Absolutely.
entrepreneurs I meet, there's a passion for what they do that was often born much earlier than when they started doing it, right? But even the name Maguey Exchange leans on, history. Was it the Aztec language? I think you said when we were talking
Yeah,
about Maguey.
absolutely.
Yeah. So
Yeah. So
go on.
so Maguey is a Nahuatl word, right? It's a language spoken by the Aztecs, right? And it means agave, right? It
Yeah.
refers to the agave plant. And Aztecs didn't just use the agave plant to create spirits, right? They used it for medicine. They used it for building materials, roof thatching, all of that, right? So it is a plant that has a profound importance of their society, just like, wood from trees has
Yeah.
to ours, right? And so I named the company Maguey Exchange, one, to pay homage to where we're starting and where we have started, right, in Mexico. And then I named it Exchange to harken back to the first activity between families, between communities, along the course of human evolution, right?
Yeah.
The exchange of something of equal or greater value. So one is the aspect of community and activity that forms the bedrock and foundation of of our DNA and what Maguey Exchange is.
Imagine if the world, we clicked our fingers and universally the world ran to a rhythm of equal or greater value. Everything would change, right?
Absolutely.
Everything would change. And the agave plant is such an unfriendly plant whilst it's growing, with all the sharp things hanging off it and everything else, but used for so many things, including medicine. When um, I'm old enough to have kind of remembered a lot of the business texts of the 80s and 90s,
Uh-huh.
and I remember when I think it was Hammer wrote, the value chain, and he was talking about, so many companies try to disrupt um, internally in the company. How could they kind of make their processes better, use better technology and things like that? But the people that win in industries are the ones that find the single most important point of constraint for a whole industry and
Hmm.
address that. And if I'm correct in my background reading, you had a thought that you would be an artisanal spirit producer at some point until you actually recognize this really important single point of constriction for an entire industry. And
Yep.
Maguey Exchange has gone about the business of fixing that point of constraint. When you're about to leap into something that has to be disruptive to address the issue you're trying to address. So you had to become disruptive, and that is an overused word today, but to be able to connect these producers from the farm to the world market, I mean, that's a big leap, right? You have to become disruptive
It
to
is.
connect that. What are some of the lessons you've learned along the way through this experience in the artisanal spirits industry and creating this global exchange, basically?
Yeah, absolutely. I can dive a little bit in the story of like how they kind
Yeah.
of grew, right? And you're absolutely right. The beginning of origin story of Maguey Exchange is, I wanted to start a spirits brand, right? A mezcal brand that focused on, the producer stories, right? In any sort of commercial activity, like you have marketing and all these other things, but what I was missing and what I didn't see in the media, the social media or commercial media, is that a lot of these human elements were missing from this like very traditional, very heritage driven process, right? I was missing the story of Rodrigo.
Yeah.
So, I started I was doing research, went to Oaxaca to start the research for the mezcal brand, and then one aspect like rose to the top of my mind during this process is why is this so hard, right? Um, Everything is fragmented, right? Today, the artisanal spirits and wine market it's virtually broken, right? It's despite growing at 29% annually, it operates still on WhatsApp messages and handshakes, right?
Mm.
And this essentially creates three critical pain points that I felt in my beginning journey of starting the brand that usually inflate costs by 15 to 25%. First, finding the right products is painful, right? Um, Buyers spend hundreds of hours a year trying to source and find people like Rodrigo. Second, connecting with producers is often very complex. There's multiple intermediaries. There's all these communities that you have to go and gain access to. It's a very complex affair that if you don't have the network and 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 um and understanding of the industry, right, and these communities, it's a very fraught endeavor, so to speak. And finally, managing the supply chain once you find a producer it's complete chaos, right? And you face delays in supply chain simply because it's really hard to connect these days, origin to destination in terms of your products. So one of the lessons I learned at first is that I like the network and understanding. And I harken back to my playbook in Afghanistan when I was a military officer, right? Oftentimes we were entering in very new, unknown areas, right? And it is critical not only for you doing the course of your job, but also for survival, right? To understand who you're dealing with and where you are. So one of those lessons I learned in terms of building Maguey Exchange is that community is very important. And we were operating with two communities, one on the producer side, people like Rodrigo, and one on the buyer side. So there's like bar, restaurant owners in the US, brand owners in the UK, et cetera. And it is important to build this mutually supportive community in order to start any enterprise or any endeavor, not just Maguey Exchange, right? And second, in terms of another lesson I learned in my life in my consulting aspect is breaking down a huge problem into its component parts. Right, there's lots of problems that are complex, and it is necessary at the outset to break these immensely complex problems like into their small component parts and what are the drivers for those, right? What are the motivations? What are the people and organizations involved? And what is the opportunity that you can, derive from this complexity, right? Because not everybody wants to manage complexity. And lastly, you know, being able to communicate your vision and what you're doing to not only your customers, but also the people to your left and right, right? My team, and are all also in terms of buyers and producers, communicating that vision and really approaching the new problem or the industry with and from a sense of understanding, from a sense of empathy, from a sense of commitment and dedication, because other people feel that as well,
Yes.
right? Those were like lessons that I learned and really honed during my construction, my build out of Maguey Exchange.
It's fascinating. There's so many things that we could lean in on, what you just spoke about. I find myself saying to people all the time, assuming that quality is a given, right? So don't take a product to market unless the quality's great. You don't deserve to sell it if the quality isn't great, right? So
Hmm.
assuming that quality is a given, we're really left with two things. We're left with packaging and communication. Basically, how do you bundle this thing and put it in someone's hands? And most companies that win in the marketplace are the ones that communicate better than everybody else, quite frankly. They're
Absolutely.
not the ones with the best product. Packaging and communication, from a business point of view, have a deep look at packaging and communication. I'm fascinated with how you're even viewing the pathway of that industry because, what wasn't in there, other than when you spoke about, adds about 15% cost in the way it traditionally goes to market.
Hmm.
Your conversation is not led with finance and economics. And
It is
yet,
not.
no, but the financial system that every company in the world uses is an industrial age financial system. And the question is, how's it going to hit the balance sheet? What's fascinating about the industrial age finance system is it does not know how to count humans as an asset. It counts them as a cost on that side of the ledger. And what's clear in your story in a world driven by AI is yours is a human driven story. Community first, community building, people first, might be an articulation. Um, I've read, I've read, uh, you referencing the idea of field first development. You clearly, and I wonder if that also comes from some of that military experience. You can do all the planning you like, but once you're in the field, but you
Hmm.
you went out and researched first. You got on the ground and went and looked. It started with you being on the ground. I'd love to speak to field first development a little bit in terms of what that means to you.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. I can definitely speak on field first development. I mean, I think the context and what actually brought me into this idea, right? I didn't call it that back in the day, but it is a term now. It started in Afghanistan. So, that trip that I referred to earlier, where I was backpacking through Mexico, I meet Rodrigo, etc. That was between my junior and senior year. After I left that romantic summer to return to my senior year of college, that college was West Point, United States Military Academy.
Yep.
And if there's a lot of things to know about West Point, but one of the biggest things is that after you graduate from that institution, you have to serve at least 5 years in the U.S. Army. So I graduated in 2011, became a U.S. Army Airborne Ranger, and deployed for my first time. Found myself in Afghanistan, Southeast Afghanistan, for the first time in 2012, right? And the beginning of the trip, my commander took me in a helicopter, went over a 500-mile radius of land, which was mostly mountainous and on the border of Pakistan, and said, "This is yours. Here are your objectives. This is your goals. Handle it." And that was it, right? So a lot of that first deployment was spent understanding the problem, visiting these villages, building relationships with tribal elders, and be able to expand and exert influence on this space in order to find the bad guys, right? As well as achieve of our objectives there, right? And that was that plus combat was about 80% of my first deployment. The other 20% was actually working in an economic development initiative with the State Department to convert Afghan farmers from farming poppy, which funds the Taliban, to something else, right? Some other sort of crop. And I had a front row seat that despite billions of dollars invested in multiple farmers converted, right? That program fell flat on its face. Why? Because of market forces, right? We did establish a system or a platform for these new farmers farming new things to sell their product. And as a result, I had to subsidize them as a whole to keep it going, right? So I saw that not only I saw that this situation with between Afghan farmers was actually very similar to the
Yeah.
situation that I saw with Rodrigo, right? Incredible products, but virtually no market access, right? And whether it was Afghan farmers or Mexican mezcaleros, the problem was identical. Like traditional producers were often cut off from global markets by opaque and inefficient supply chains. So, putting on my Afghanistan hat later, many years later in Mexico, I attacked the problem at first. I went to every community, right? Every state that produced agave spirits, sat with producers, sat in their distilleries, are virtually their homes, right?
Mm.
Learned about their process, learned about the nuances of production, and then also had conversations of, if you were king for a day, right? One of my favorite questions to ask: if you're king for a day, what would you change about this entire situation? So really understanding their pain points and problems with dealing with the industry, right? And from those conversations became even more fruitful conversations about how can we apply technology, systems, processes to make their lives easier. And making their lives easier really relied on helping them earn more, right? In order to support their family and community, right? Because working with agave generally is still very difficult. Really
Yeah.
can't cut out the work. But that's why there's the foundation of the artisanal spirits and wine industry. In many industries, think about tea and coffee, there are people doing things, right? There are people picking coffee beans. There are people, like Rodrigo distilling alcohol, which takes, a month or, around a month to complete. So that's the context and how I applied military experience or my Afghan playbook, right? Afghanistan playbook to under first interacting with these communities in terms of empathy and understanding, and then working together, cooperation to build a solution that works for everybody, right? And the vision for Maguey Exchange is, it's not just software to me. It's not just technology. We're building digital infrastructure for the next generation of artisanal spirits producers or artisanal producers anywhere. Think Etsy, starting with artisanal spirits and wine, and think about all the other industries it can affect, from
Absolutely.
fashion to pharmaceuticals, anywhere that there are still people forming the foundation of an industry.
Yes. And we'll talk about purpose in a little while, but your purpose has been giving you breadcrumbs your entire life through your experiences
Mm-hmm.
and all these circumstances. Um, and, it is fascinating that a driving force for you has been add value at every level of the chain, add value, not extract value at every level of the chain.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes in some industries, you see this pattern where companies have slipped into, well, how can we extract greatest value out of the growers and producers, for example? And you're flipping that on its head and saying, how can we add value to the growers and producers and give them generational sustainability, right? It's
Absolutely.
got to last. What are some of the lessons that you've bumped your head up against in terms of the challenges of trying to tackle a set of systemic, you were tackling systemic problems. These were not, oh, we'll fix this one thing. This was a system level kind of failure. What are some of the lessons or challenges you've bumped your head up against as you've reinvented a system?
Yeah, I mean, I mean, the challenges are many and they're every day, right? For building something like of this enterprise, right? And one of the challenges, and we've touched on this like a little bit ago, is establishing the vision, right? I
Mm.
mean, we already talked about how I went from starting a Mezcal brand to building, the infrastructure and building the Gay Exchange, the infrastructure for artisanal trade or local production, global distribution. That's a huge leap, right? And communicating that and understanding and having the ecosystem, producers and buyers understand that was the first challenge, right? And I really have to refine like what is the effect and what's the outcome that I want to achieve with this? Why am I doing it? Right?
Mm.
And what's the path to get there? Why am I doing that? Because of people like Rodrigo, like Afghan farmers that I met during my deployment, right? I'm doing it for them. However, I am also doing it from a person that tried to enter in the system and ask that question, why is it so hard? Why is it so difficult? This works well in a lot of other industries, but in this industry, there's a lack of infrastructure and multiple like tons of complexity. So in terms of communicating the vision and, understanding like where I was going with it, that was literally the first challenge. Second challenge I would say is technology integration, right? Everybody likes to slap on the AI moniker, AI term onto
Yeah.
anything that they're trying to make better, right? And I would argue that AI shouldn't necessarily be your first solution, right? Your first solution should focus on the people and the systems and the communities that are behind that, right? So the technology integration of one, understanding what are the pain points and the problems, the challenges that these producers face, understanding those on the buy side, and then building technology to connect the two that speak different languages, communicate differently, right? Have different cultural, themes and foundations, right? How can we connect them together to, build together, right? And to grow together.
Yeah.
So that was a big challenge in terms of, building technology that suits both sides. And that involved more conversations. That really involved really delving deep into like what is keeping them up at night, what is making, them upset, what is making their lives a lot harder, just clearing obstacles. And last but not least, you talked a little bit about, the content more or less, or marketing, the
Yeah.
communication, right? There's a huge education piece with Maguey Exchange. There's a huge education in the industry because a lot of people do not know where their anything from their food, their eggs, their avocados, their cashews, or their spirits and wine come from, right? So there's a huge education piece that, I think, what we've replicated and done and built from is like this kind of chef's table style approach to talking about these communities, right? And Chef's Table is a show on Netflix that goes into the history and traditions, motivations of famous chefs in different restaurants around the world, right? And this came from talking to people like Rodrigo, talking to these producers, sitting at their distilleries for hours on end, learning about their production and also figuring out how can we help them, right? These long stories about their family, about why they're doing what they're doing, about struggles, challenges, right? Dangers of production. And I asked myself, why is this? Why haven't I seen any of this really, right? So then we went out and did it. We now have an incredible video series on Instagram and YouTube that tells the stories of these producers. We're not selling a bottle, telling you the price. It's not like very anything commercial. It's really telling stories of these communities and the heritage behind them, right? And that education forms a lot of the bedrock of not only our like us proclaiming the vision and the direction that we're going to, but us still paying homage to that moniker, Maguey Exchange, right?
Oh,
To
yeah.
community on both sides.
It's interesting. I've actually spent a little bit of time in tequila in Mexico,
Amazing.
and been up close and personal with tequila production and the farming and harvesting of the agave, and it's really clear that these people put the souls of generations into every bottle,
Absolutely.
and is that story being told? So when someone opens that bottle, do they actually really appreciate, what is coming out as it's poured? And that idea of chef's table, content as trust. Content as trust should be a marketing byline for the world
Yeah,
today.
absolutely. That was good.
It's my great hope of AI is that we see AI as a way to elevate people, not replace people. And unfortunately,
Mhm.
the running conversation at the moment is how you can use AI to replace people. Um, Companies only exist because of people. There's no
Right.
purpose of a company if you don't have humans to buy, consume, want certain outcomes or whatever. So, starting at a people first level, is something we need to hold on to a little bit. You
Mhm.
made an interesting comment before, and I want to go back to it because I'd love to lean into this idea of purpose. You spoke about the importance of getting everyone onto to understand what the vision is. And what did you say the question was?
Oh, if you were king for a day,
If you
yeah,
were keen
what
for
would
a
you
day,
do?
what would you
Yeah,
do?
if you were king for a day, what would you do?
Yeah, I have a question I use all the time, which is what seems impossible, but if you could do it, that would change everything. And
Uh,
that's a challenging thought process. Just like if you were keen for a day, what would you do? It's a small question. If you were keen for a day, just one day, what would you do? That's the purpose question, actually. What would you
yeah.
do with that one day? So when you think about the role of purpose, and I would imagine as well, when you're a military officer in the field, you know, to get your team moving, there's got to be something that they believe in. Um, the leadership lessons from the battlefield, I think, are often spoken about. People need to be aligned behind something. I'd love you to lean in further on, things you've discovered and learned through your consulting. As a consultant, you're outside with no direct line of authority, but still trying to
Hmm.
influence. As a military officer, you have very direct line of authority. As the CEO and founder of Maguey Exchange, you have absolute authority in so many ways, but still people make a choice based on whether they actually
Hmm.
buy in or not. I'd love to kind of get some of your lessons around how do you build that fabric of purpose um, in everyone around you. In what are your top five things you find yourself doing over and over again to keep building purpose?
Yeah, I mean, the top five things that I find myself built doing over and over again in order to like equip purpose. And I hit on this and I've hit on this a couple times in our conversation, and that's you can't be you can't be a great leader. You can't be a great even manager, right? Can't be a great family member without having some aspect of empathy, right? And empathy is different from sympathy. It's not like I'm feeling your pain. It's like I understand your pain, right? Um, and although you may not feel it acutely, right? Somebody burns their hand on the stove, right? You don't feel that, but you're like, because maybe you've done it before as well, right? But being like a leader that practices empathy is understanding not only everyone on your team, like who they are, but what are their motivations? Why do they wake up every day, right? What makes them happy? What makes them sad, right? That is one of the lessons that I've brought from, the military. You can't lead young men and women into combat, right? In an uncertain situation and possibly grave danger without really understanding them on an intrinsic level as a person, right? And also supporting who they are, right? And growing together. Um, Another aspect like that is key to building teams is having a vision, right? Um, that I've learned, right? You have to have a direction. You don't have to have the destination, you have to have a direction, right? Um, Even in basic military navigation, right? When you don't know where you are, the first the first thing you do is establish what's north, south, east, or west, right? You need to understand what direction you are walking in. So then you can find that destination eventually. You can't have one without the other. So in having that vision is understanding what you want and also what's best for the group as a whole, in your opinion, and charting a course and communicating that course to a person. I mean, I've had someone from the lowest levels of the military or the most junior levels, excuse me, like a private, they will still question you if you're not able to communicate that, hey, we're going generally north, right? Because of this, right? If you can't establish a vision, which is the direction for the group, then that's going to make this journey, that's going to make leadership, that's going to make building teams or doing any sort of endeavor that much harder, right? Externally and internally.
Yeah.
Another aspect is resilience and adaptability, right? I've had to, show a resilience in both situations. One in from the military, two in terms of consulting, right? There's resilience that humans exhibit in all things, right? And resilience is all about you know, getting up, right, when you're knocked down, as well as being adaptable to changing situations. Nothing is constant, right? I think it's like, what is a Mike Tyson quote? It's like everybody has a plan until they get punched in the face, right?
Yeah.
Or in the military, there's an adage like, no plan ever survives first contact. And first contact refers to when you encounter the enemy, right? And start the fight, right? No plan ever survives first contact. So in the military, the resilience, the primary like sources of resilience were through the, infantry and ranger training that I endured, jumping out of airplanes, right? Being cold, being wet and cold, being super hot, all sometimes in the same day. It's more like that grit and resilience to like take what life and nature and universe throws at you and keeps going and keep going, right? In consulting, the resilience was, being intellectually challenged all the time, being forced to think, be smarter than the client, right? And think about, how best to serve them and also come up with an innovative way to solve a problem that's probably been plaguing them for many years, right? And that intellectual resilience is something that I learned from consulting, right? And then let's see, we have two more problem solving skills, right? Once again, breaking out a complex problem into its component parts, understanding those drivers, understanding those levers by which you can actually make an effect, right? And doing the research and due
Yeah.
diligence to really figure out if you're making the right call, right? And that brings me to my last point is making the right call, right? It's you make a call and then you follow it, right? And you can adjust it along the way, but having, being deliberate, having that speed and, confidence in your decision making not only keeps you from potentially ruining a great plan, right? But also gives confidence in the people that you're working with the people that you're working with that like, all right, yeah, this is my decision that I'm sticking to it, right? Of course, you can listen to feedback and everything, but you still have to make a decision. You still have to take a step forward, right? And if you are shuffling side to side instead of taking a step forward, that not only, diminishes confidence in the entire enterprise, but also the people that are working alongside you.
Yeah. It's, I love all of that. A key, I also spent, a 25-year career as a consultant in Australia to governments and the military actually,
Mm,
and, very large Australian companies and international companies. And part of the job of leadership is to lead people into chaos safely.
absolutely.
Almost everything that we do requires change, and that means leading people into chaos. And over the years, I've noticed there's a direct proportional relationship between the confidence your team have about heading into chaos and the courage you display as the leader. So leadership courage equals team confidence. And that courage, what's the first demonstration of leadership courage? Make a decision. Have the courage to actually make a decision, right? How do you make a great decision? Great intel, field first development. You got to learn about the field in the field. Intel is everything.
Mm,
What's the data telling you? And then what's the intuition of the people actually telling you? Because intuition is data as well. It's fascinating. As a consultant, you work with Fortune 500 companies and foreign governments. Um, in the military, you're an officer, you were in the field, but you had hierarchy above you. And for a lot of people listening to or watching this episode might be at the front end of a leadership career. We don't often
mm,
talk about it, but there are some skills required to lead upwards, right? When you're working with a foreign government or a Fortune 500 company as a consultant, as I said, you don't have the hierarchical authority, but you are trying to lead leaders who, in a structural sense, maybe have a higher level of authority. Do you have any tips, particularly for younger people, at the start of their journey on leading upwards in a way that actually shapes decisions that are above you? We don't talk about it often, but it's actually a superpower if you can do it.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, leading upwards or managing up is very crucial skill for effective leadership. Not only like in the military or consulting or, even at West Point, right? Because it's built on, military leadership, right? And everyone in addition to your academic and, athletic pursuits, you had a position in during your entire time at West Point, right? And you had leaders there. So that was the kind of lab for by which, a lot of cadets, myself included, tested like, our leadership skills and refine those to the day that we'd be leading soldiers in combat. So it's the foundation, and I would say there's a couple of key skills. First one is strategic communication, right? In consulting, I had to communicate complex ideas succinctly and also persuasively to my principal, to the partner over the group. And how I would do this is regularly provide information that either they were thinking about that they needed to know to make a decision, or give them updates by being more like by being closer to the problem essentially. So, and I would say that the tactical piece of advice is, you need to understand that leader, understand who you're reporting to. Not only just like I talked about earlier, understanding your team. You have to understand their motivations,
Yeah.
what they eat for breakfast in the morning, what are like, how are they feeling, their mood, right? And you need to tailor your communication styles in order for them to receive it. That doesn't mean change the information, but that means change the delivery, right? In order to, maximize the impact of your messages. And you can use data-driven presentations or briefs, right, to do this, or just talking over the lunch table, right? I would often go on walks with leaders. I still go on walks with some members of my team, and we just chat, enjoying the sunshine, right? Especially here in Mexico City. Um, Another one is like understanding their goals and priorities. The more you can understand their goals and priorities, you can understand how what you're suggesting or the course that you guys are taking, how does that align with their goals and priorities? Everybody has motivations, everybody has sub objectives that they need to attain, you know, but we're all human. Sometimes we haven't thought it through, as much as we should have, right? But understanding that overarching goal and the priorities, that helps you communicate better. That actually helps you drive a discussion towards a conclusion. Anticipation, right? And proactive problem solving, being there first, saying, hey, like if I went to you, like Simon, and was like, hey, I knew that you were going to be, delivering this report in a couple of days. Here's some pieces of information or data that I've thought about that could help with that, right? Simon, you're going to thank me. You're going to be like, oh man, you not only anticipated what I was going through, you showed empathy, but you are also proposing solutions that are not only making my life easier, but is also, showing that, you care for me. Those are like two aspects, right? There's the
Mm.
business reason, and there's the human reason, right? That I'm going to automatically listen to what you have to say. And then finally, I would say feedback is very important, right? And I've seen, this go very well or poorly in both the military and consulting, right? Establishing that trust, establishing that openness, that channel of communication where you're giving very real and transparent feedback to each other, right? Establishing that rapport, that is vital to forming the team, building a better relationship and bonding and partnership with your manager, with your leader, but also bringing the team a bit better, so you can move forward as one unit, right? And
Yeah.
even in the military, teams were distinguished not only by their skill and execution, but their ability to move forward as one unit. You see a team, a great team when you see one. Everyone knows without speaking what the other person is thinking and what they're about to do, right? And part of that feedback leads to the adaptation mechanism for a team, right? So those will be my like key
Fantastic.
points or learnings for managing up.
Yeah, there's just some things that you said that I really want to highlight. Not least of which, both when you're talking about your team and kind of leading and managing upwards in different ways, you've basically said start where they're at, like understand
Mm-hmm.
them, their goals and priorities, and who they are and what's going on with them and for them, start where they're at. So often when people are trying to achieve something big, they're trying to tell everyone where they're going to be. You know, this is where we're going, this is where we're going to be, which is necessary. But if it doesn't also have a piece about starting where they're at, you don't get the empathy and connection. You know, when you said, you know, even the private wants you to say, we're going north because might be the most important word. We're
Absolutely.
not just going
Because
north.
they're gonna ask why. They're gonna be
Yeah,
like, why?
yeah, yeah. So we're going north because, as opposed to we're going north, just do it. You know, there's this, you know, there's these nuances that come from experience, you know, rather than training. And you know, if you think about Maguey Exchange, you know, I could have asked, do you see it stepping into other fields of agriculture? But you've already actually said, I can see it stepping into other entire industries as a model. Um, you know, what's the picture you see for this at that big picture level? You know, you're 20 years down the track, and you've had this. You know, it's everything you planned it to be, and
Hmm.
it's changed the world, right? In terms of connecting the source to the end consumption or use in a way
Hmm.
that adds value at every step, doesn't just extract value out of every step. Equal or increased value, right? At every step.
Yep, absolutely.
What, you know, you're 20 years down the track. What are you sitting there looking at and celebrating? And I suspect it's not just artisanal, you know, spirits. It's you've created something else. What's the real change here?
Yeah, I mean, yeah, 20 years is a while for now. But
Depend,
yeah,
depend, depend,
let me start.
depends how old you are, Rob. For some of us, 20
Yeah.
years.
Yeah, I understand. I understand. I was, some of my like best friends that I met, at West Point, especially in the military, that was almost 20 years from now, or
Yeah.
before now. So, like, I mean, let's start with like a 5 year vision, and I can expand to the 20-year vision, right? So, I mean, our 5 year vision, like relies on, global expansion, technology integration, and sustainability, right? 1 in 5 years from now, we've expanded our platform still on artisanal spirits and wine globally, not only focusing on markets like Europe, but Asia and South America. And this strengthens all these connections between these far-flung worlds. Right now, I mean, in the US, everybody's used to getting something in 2 days or something like that. But, in the US, no one really has any sort of timeline or connectivity expectations from something coming from Vietnam, right? So it's bringing the world together and expanding the platform globally. And additionally, in terms of sustainability, we are now as consumers, caring more about who's behind the product, where does it come from, and how did it get to us, right? And we are all, and with, geopolitical issues as well as climate issues, we are taking a hard look at, all these systems that we've built that just pull rather than pull in a sustainable way or build an ecosystem that it's self-replenishing, right? And I'd like, and in 5 years, we're going to expand these sustainability initiatives amongst producers, right, including support for organic farming, water conservation, which is a big thing in a lot of parts of the world, as well as like fair labor practices. And all this brings value in terms of facilitating access to international markets for producers, which increases their revenue potential, but really increases their ability to take care of the community and their families, and also expands their global footprint and driving sustainability into, the industry. Now, if we expand that bubble 5 years from now into 20 years from now, that's super that's super heady, right? But I would say that the 20-year vision for Maguey Exchange rests on obviously us becoming a major industry player, right? With our hands, and people and network in anywhere from Kazakhstan to Angola, right? But also that cultural preservation aspect, right? We're dealing with fifth generation spirits producers, right? I want to deal with fifth generation coffee producers. I want to deal with fifth generation, wool producers in Turkey, right? And with that, you know, by including these people 20 years from now in our network, we're actively participating in cultural preservation and heritage, right? We know the tales of many different things that used to exist 10, 20 years from now that don't exist anymore because they just essentially died out, right? Even in Mexico in the 80s, there were less producers because people were coming to the States to work, right, and earn money, right? So a lot of these cultural these icons and processes of cultural heritage have a tendency to die out if not supported and sustained, right? And we're ensuring that this cultural preservation doesn't get lost in modernization, right? All for AI, all for space travel, all for all of these things, realizing our Star Wars dreams, but it still comes from, as we've been saying over and over again in this conversation, this bedrock of people and culture, and that matters to me, right? And lastly, I want to provide and pioneer a new business model where it's community-led growth, right? Right now, at the beginning of the Maguey Exchange, Rob Weir went out to all these places, found tons of producers, convinced them to work with us, etc. Now, these communities, they grow on their own. Producers are referring us to each other, right? Buyers are referring to us to each other. So I feel like, not I feel like we are pioneering a new business model that benefits both sides. It's capitalist, right, in terms of people earning revenue, but it's also community driven, right? And leads to certain things like cooperative ownership structures, right? Profit sharing models, direct to consumer sales platforms, right? What we're doing in 20 years is proving out and validating this new business model of community led growth, and we change it by preserving traditional production methods, cultures, as well as redefining these standards of how people interact with each other in terms of trade. Hence, we go back to Maguey Exchange, right? That's my 20-year vision.
I love all of that. It's not denying technology and AI and innovation. It's the intersection of innovation and
Mm,
tradition. And again, it's a people first approach. And based on that idea of, you know, offer equal or greater value at every step of the way. I mean, this is a fascinating business model because people are buying more consciously. Um, and, you know, there will be a generational change as well, where I think some of that thinking will become more the norm in how do you build and grow a company, but community led, business. I grew up in very small country towns in Western Australia, where business in town was the central pillar of the community, but they were members of the community. They were at the tennis club, and they were, you were playing sport against them on the weekends and things like that. So your reputation wasn't just during business hours. Your reputation was 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. And I think the other aspect, pursuing this intersection between innovation and tradition, anyone that's built and started a company knows you need a brand story. And often the
mhm,
brand story starts with the founder. You've unpacked a model that allows you to create a brand story that started 5 generations prior. Now, that's actually invaluable in terms of marketing. If we want to put the business hat on, marketing value,
mhm.
story value, and everything else. So it's a fantastic model. I'd love to wrap up with 3 quick questions just for people to understand a bit more about Rob Weir. If you're game, short, sharp
I'm always game.
answer. Do you have a personal philosophy that you've already said, if you were keen for a day, that's kind of a personal philosophy, but do you have a personal philosophy you carry every day that just kind of drives how you behave, not behave, how you show up on a day-to-day basis?
Yeah, I mean, I would say that one of the first things is like showing up, right? Um, Communication, community is very like transactional these days, right? You're doom scrolling through Instagram, you're doom scrolling through TikTok, right? The showing up aspect, and I'll get into the philosophy behind that later, is just like you have to be there, right? You have to look someone in the eyes and, understand who they are as a person and engage with that. And not say, oh, I want this little piece of you, or can you do this for me? And you go through the day, right? But I mean, one of the key philosophy I would say that I carry with me every day that was, built in the crucible from West Point to Afghanistan to consulting to how I show up to work every day in Maguey Exchange is leadership through service, right? Bar none, right? You need to understand how to be a servant before you can be a leader. You have to understand how to serve others before you can lead others, right? And leading from the front is who I am, right?
Mm.
I not only serve others first, but I'm the one that takes the first step, right? I'm the one that that goes through the door first, right? And this approach not only I mean, it builds trust, right?
Yeah.
You can have follow-on interviews with every team member of Maguey Exchange and everyone who I've worked with, be it military, consulting, etc. You know, it's trust,
Yeah.
inspiration. It's are we in this together, right? But understand that, I'm not the one, getting served tea all the time. A lot of the time, I'm the one serving tea, right? Because they're one and the same to me, right? And leadership through service is one of my core principles and philosophies that I live by. And I will lead from the front. I will be the first one to do it.
Fantastic. You've been a skill builder, West Point, uh, learning on the ground in Afghanistan.
Hmm.
You were a learner and an acquirer even when you were backpacking. Straight out of school, if you like, back into college to get to study, get your MBA, and work as a consultant. So, what is the if you could instantly, and all of that is learning and practice, and
Hmm.
if you could instantly master a skill with no requirement for practice or anything, you just like bang, you've got it. What would you love to have mastered or be able to master without doing the work to get it?
I mean, I own a technology company, so like the first thing that came to mind is like engineering, coding, like computer engineering, coding, right? That is one of the skills that that I would love to master without doing any work. And along with that, like data,
Yeah.
understanding data, right? I did get my concentration degree in econometrics and economics at Booth, University of Chicago Booth. But there's like now we're bludgeoned with data from every time we wake up our and look at our phone, right? For news notifications to, doing analysis for a financial model. Data is everywhere and it's increasing at an increasing rate and it's not going to stop. So the kind that space between like data scientists and computer engineer is like a skill I would love to master without putting a lot of work into it.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Even the space between data scientist and psychologist,
Uh-huh.
is an interesting thing to think about. And that now we're in the world of big data and it behaves differently. When it becomes
Mhm.
big data, it's pretty fascinating. What last quick question? What did you think you wanted to be when you grew up, back when you were a kid? Because I suspect it's not you weren't thinking artisanal spirits.
I was not actually. So yeah, we'll let a little bit of my nerd out. Like, I mean, when I was growing up, I wanted to be an astronaut,
Right.
right? And I like always love space. I love everything space, even like science fiction, all of that. When I was growing up, I wanted to be an astronaut, and like my family, we have a tradition of military service. Like everyone to my great great grandparents have served in the armed forces, be it Navy, Air Force, Marines, Army, etc. Right. So I saw that as like a natural path to me because most astronauts they're either scientists first or they're some sort of pilot, right? And this came to a head when I applied to college and I got into West Point. I was also considering, the Air Force Academy in Annapolis, the Naval Academy. And from the first time I set foot on the West Point's campus, I saw that breed of leadership, that breed of like servant leadership, right? And leading from the front. that, it automatically made me enamored with the institution, right? But I joined West Point. I still was like, I could be an Army pilot. And then I got introduced to the infantry and the concept of what a U.S. Army Ranger is, or what like a Green Beret or Special Forces. I was like, I'll do this, right? So, what growing up, I wanted to be an astronaut, but experiences and meeting, going to West Point for the first time, changed that and evolved that to a different sort of goal, right?
Well, you're still crossing frontiers.
Well done.
They're different frontiers, but you're still crossing frontiers. Rob, I want to thank you for the time that you've generously given us. And, I would challenge everybody watching or listening to this episode to pick through the conversation for the lessons that come out of that. I mean, how do you tackle an entire industry and find the single most restrictive choke point and fix that? But how do you do that in a way that adds equal or greater value to every step of the way? In this increasingly technological world that we live in, how do you build a business that puts people first and is community led? How do we manage the intersection between traditions and generational wisdom and innovation? And then, having built something amazing in a specific application, artisanal spirits, having the vision to see its capacity to be applicable across a whole range of applications to fundamentally, change the way we solve a problem, take a product to market that sees people being rewarded all the way through in the way that they should. There's some really fundamental challenges in here for business leaders of the future. In terms of building businesses that matter, if business is one of the most powerful forces we've got on the planet, there's so many things that Rob's talked about today that we should be constantly thinking about as we build the balance sheet by building people. Rob, thank you so much for your time today. I really, really appreciate it. And I just look forward to watching Maguey Exchange with interest and seeing what it turns into.
I appreciate it, Simon. Thanks for the opportunity speaking today, and really looking forward to not only building with the team, but building with people like you, building with the community, right? That's what we're all about. And, looking forward to supporting each other.
Fantastic. Thank you.